Ready to unlock some secrets about German verbs? You've brought some fascinating research with you today, and we're going way beyond just the grammar rules. We're going deep into the how and why.
It's true. German verbs get this reputation right for being overly complicated. But honestly, the systems are surprisingly logical.
Totally. And one thing that really jumped out from your research was how textbooks label strong verbs. They call them irregular, but it's not totally accurate, is it?
No, not at all. Really, it's more about recognizing that German verbs have different ways of showing tense. So you have weak verbs, those add like a D or T sound in the past, and then you have the strong verbs, and those change their vowel sound. But both types follow really consistent patterns.
Okay, so let's break these patterns down a bit more. What's the logic behind the vowel-changing system with strong verbs?
Well, it's actually super interesting. It's like a journey back in time. It's called a blout, and it has roots in ancient Germanic languages. And the vowel sound itself, not like an ending or anything, but the sound itself signals the tense.
So instead of tacking on an ed, it's like the word itself morphs to show past tense. It's kind of cool.
Exactly. And what's really neat is that this vowel change, this gradation, it often highlights the action itself. So like singin' to thing becomes sang in the past. And that shift to a shorter, sharper vowel, it mirrors the act of singing. Like you finished, you can almost like feel the difference in the sound.
I totally see what you mean. It's like the language itself is trying to embody the action. That makes those so-called irregular verbs seem way more intentional. Let's move on to another key player in German verbs. Prefixes. You were saying earlier they're like puzzle pieces. How so?
Yes. German prefixes are so powerful. They can completely change the meaning of a verb, but the change is systematic. Think about the verb legen. So that means to lay.
Okay, legen. Got it. Sounds straightforward.
Now watch what happens when we bring in prefixes. Ablegen becomes to abandon. Anlegen means to invest or even to dock. And auslegen means to lay out. One prefix, totally different meaning.
So a small set of prefixes can unlock a ton of expressions from just one verb. That's pretty efficient, especially once you get a handle on it.
Exactly. This system really opens up vocabulary as you learn German. But, and this is important, prefixes can be tricky. They can change verbs into something else entirely, like take intelligent. That prefix, and it actually turns the word into an adjective, means far away, not even a verb anymore.
Wait, really? That's a bit of a curveball for someone learning. How do you even know when a prefix is going to do that?
Well, that's where really understanding German grammar comes in handy, and luckily that's what we're here to help you with today.
Exactly. So we've got prefixes adding all these dimensions of meaning to verbs, but it gets even more interesting because prefixes can be separable too, right? What does that even mean?
Yeah, you're right. It's another whole layer to German verbs.
Yeah.
Separable prefixes are so cool because they can actually detach from the verb and move to a different part of the sentence.
Okay, so they don't like literally fly away, but they move around within the sentence.
That's a great way to put it. For someone learning German, it might seem strange at first, but it creates this really interesting dynamic in sentence structure.
Yeah.
For example, the verb anfangen, to start. You could say, ich fange mit der Arbeit an. I start with work. Did you notice how an separated from fangen and went all the way to the end?
So the verb splits up, and the prefix ends up at the other end of the sentence. That is a very visual way to think about it. But it gets even more interesting, doesn't it? Because some prefixes can be separable and inseparable.
You're exactly right. It's true. Certain prefixes can be both, depending on really subtle shifts in meaning. It's like they have a secret double life. Keeps things interesting, right?
It definitely does. It's making me realize how dynamic German verbs really are.
And we're just getting started. Remember those dative verbs we were talking about earlier? They add a whole other layer to German grammar. Dative verbs, they're a really good example of how German grammar, it's not just about like rules on a page, It's about showing how things relate to each other in a sentence, like the subtle ways that meaning is built.
Yeah, the dative case is definitely one that trips people up, but I feel like it's because we're just so used to thinking in terms of like a subject, verb, object, like this thing acts upon that thing.
I think you've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
In English, so much depends on word order to show those relationships. But in German, you've got cases like the dative that just add this whole other layer of information. It's less about what the action is done to and more about the role of a person or thing in relation to that action.
Could you give an example for our listeners so they can really hear how that works?
Sure. Let's take the verb helfen, to help. So in English, we'd say, I help you. But in German, it's ich helfe dir. I helped you. See that tiny change to dir? It shows us that you isn't the direct object. You're the recipient of the help. The dative case is what highlights that.
Ah, that's really clear. So it's like the dative gives the verb a more specific target. It's not helping generally, it's helping you.
Yes, exactly. And you see this with lots of verbs in German. Gefallen, it always takes a dative object. We'd say, I like you, but in German it's du gefällst mir. Literally, you are pleasing to me.
Wow, so even something as basic as liking is expressed so differently with the dative. It's how you're affected by the thing you like. This is really giving me a new appreciation for dative verbs.
Glad to hear it. Ready to dive into another cool aspect of German verbs.
Bring it on. Honestly, the more we uncover, the more I feel like I'm actually starting to get the logic, Like, it's really elegant.
In that case, let's talk about the zu infinitive.
Yeah.
You can almost think of it like the English gerund, but, with that special German twist.
Okay, zu infinitive sounds a little intimidating. Break it down. What's so special?
All right, so English, we use gerunds to make those verb-like nouns, running, reading, things like that. The zu infinitive can work in a similar way. You take the infinitive of a verb, let's say lernen, to learn, stick zu in front, and you've got to lernen.
So zu lernen, that would be to learning.
Not exactly. While direct translation is tricky, zu lernen can express purpose. Or it even creates phrases that act like adjectives almost. It's all about adding a layer of detail.
Okay, need an example here to really picture it.
Of course. Imagine you see a sign that says, die zu lernenden Vokabeln. This means the vocabulary to be learned.
Ah, so zu lernenden, that's describing the vocabulary, like learnable, but just more grammatically interesting.
Exactly. That little zu before lernenden, that's our cue. It's a special kind of phrase modifying that noun, Vokabeln, highlights the purpose or intended action related to it.
Interesting. Almost like the zu infinitive makes this mini clause inside the sentence.
You got it. And this is barely even scratching the surface of what you can do with it. You'll find it popping up all over in different structures.
This is making me realize German packs so much into its verbs and how they're built. Every little piece has a purpose.
Absolutely. And as you learn these structures, you start to see how nuanced but also efficient it all is.
We've done weak, strong verbs, prefixes, those dative verbs. Now zu infinitive. I have a feeling there are more surprises in store when it comes to German verbs, though, right?
I think you're onto something there. German verbs, yeah, they can be intricate, but they're like well-designed tools. Each one has this specific purpose, the way it conveys meaning.
It really is like that. Like figuring out how a complex machine works, the more you learn about the pieces, the more you can appreciate the whole thing.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And speaking of the whole system, this might surprise you, but German grammar even borrows from other languages.
Oh, really? Now I'm curious. I've always found it fascinating how languages influence each other.
Have you ever heard of the accusativus cum infinitivo?
Accusativus cum infinitivo. That sounds, well, it's got a certain ring to it.
Right. It's actually a Latin influence on German.
Latin is hiding out in German verbs. You're kidding.
Sort of. It's called ACI for short, and basically it's a sentence structure. You use a bare infinitive, so that's without the zu, and it comes after the main verb. But here's the thing. There's an accusative object right in between them.
Okay, yeah, definitely going to need an example for this one.
Makes sense. Let's say you want to say, I hear you singing. In German, using the ACI, you'd say, ich höre dich singen.
Let me get this straight. Dich, that's you, the accusative object, and then singen, to sing, that's our bare infinitive. So it's like, I hear you specifically in the act of singing.
Exactly. The ACI, it lets you show that the accusative object, in this case you, is doing that infinitive verb.
That's so cool, like a shortcut, but for grammar to show that relationship. We've talked a lot about how verbs can change, but what about verbs turning into different parts of speech altogether? Like, we can take the verb photograph and make it photographer, a noun.
You're talking about what we call agent nouns, those nouns that describe someone doing the action. And yep, you guess it, German has a way to do that too, systematically, of course.
Should have known better than to think German wouldn't have a system. So how does it work?
Actually, it's pretty simple. Usually, you just take the verb stem, add an ending. Like the verb fahren, to drive, that becomes Fahrer, a driver. And if you need to say female driver, you use the feminine ending, fahren.
Even when verbs become nouns, still that German emphasis on being clear and precise.
Exactly. And that's really something you find throughout German verbs, this logic, this order, even when things seem really complex at first.
Isn't it funny how something that seemed kind of intimidating, German verbs, I'm looking at you, but then once you start to see the patterns, the why behind it all, it becomes really fascinating.
That's the beauty of learning languages, isn't it? It pushes you, makes you rethink what you thought you knew, and you find these systems, stories, hidden within the language itself.
And speaking of stories, I think we've only just scratched the surface of German verbs today.
We have, but we've explored how logical they are, how they've changed over time, how they show these intricate relationships. But there's always more to discover, always another layer.
So, to everyone listening, don't stop exploring, keep asking questions, and you'll keep finding those aha moments. That's what makes language learning so rewarding. Until next time.